June 29th, 1974. Darmstadt, West Germany. The morning sun fell cold and sterile through the blinds of a small apartment where an old admiral sat before an open book, The Ultra-Secret, a memoir that had just reached German shelves, rested on Admiral Karl Dönitz's desk. Its pages trembled faintly beneath his weathered hands as he read the line that changed everything he believed about the war he had fought 3 decades earlier. From May 1940 onward, we read the German naval, army, and air force traffic almost as quickly as the Germans themselves. The words struck him like a torpedo. Dönitz, the man once trusted with Germany's submarine fleet, and later the final head of the Third Reich, was 83 years old, now a relic of a vanished empire. As he reached the end of the paragraph, his aide noticed the color drain from his face. The secret he had never even imagined was now in print. The Allies had been reading his every command. For 30 years, Dönitz had sought explanations for why his submarines had vanished into the Atlantic depths, 783 of them lost, over 30,000 men entombed beneath the waves. He had blamed radar, air patrols, superior Allied production, even the fickle fortune of the sea. But none of those things explained how convoys could consistently evade his wolf packs, how supply ships hidden across millions of square miles were found, as if by divination, or how the British always seemed to know where his boats would surface. Now it all made sense. The Enigma. The machine he had sworn was mathematically unbreakable had been broken. The irony was brutal. For years, Dönitz had enforced the most stringent communication protocols in the German military. His officers were trained in secrecy. Code books were printed with dissolving ink to prevent capture, and any commander who failed to destroy cryptographic materials faced execution. He had believed that faith in Enigma was faith in German science itself, precise, elegant, superior. But the numbers that had once given him comfort now mocked him. Enigma's 1023 theoretical configurations had meant nothing against the creativity of mathematicians and engineers working in huts across the English countryside. The Allied effort to break the cipher had mobilized thousands of mathematicians, linguists, typists, and the earliest computers. Where Germany had relied on faith in unassailable equations, Britain had industrialized logic. It was a different kind of warfare, fought not with torpedoes but with patterns, paper, and patience. By 1941, while Dönitz directed wolf packs across the Atlantic, Polish mathematicians and British cryptanalysts were dismantling the myth of Enigma piece by piece. In Bletchley Park, machines known as bombes, later the world's first programmable computers, processed messages faster than any human could. Each breakthrough shortened the war and sealed the fate of every submarine Dönitz sent to sea. Even before 1942, there had been warnings. German intelligence officers had questioned how Allied aircraft appeared at remote refueling points, or why convoys suddenly changed direction moments before contact. Yet each time investigations reached the same comforting conclusion. An insight into our cipher does not come into consideration. It was a phrase repeated so often it became dogma. When the Bismarck was hunted and destroyed in 1941, Dönitz and Admiral Erich Raeder blamed superior British radar and aerial reconnaissance. When wolf packs were ambushed at their assembly points in 1943, the blame shifted to advanced detection technologies the Germans believed were years ahead of their own. None of them imagined that British officers were reading their exact orders. The tragedy was not ignorance alone, it was certainty. Dönitz's command system, the pride of German naval innovation, depended on constant radio communication. Each day he sent and received over 70 encrypted messages directing every submarine like pieces on a chessboard. That same precision gave the Allies total visibility. To British intelligence, the Atlantic was a glass sea. Declassified records decades later confirmed what the book on Dönitz's desk revealed: every operational order, every change of tactics, every refueling schedule, all were decrypted within hours. In some cases, Allied commanders read messages before German recipients even received them. From a modern perspective, the scale of the achievement is staggering. A team of 9,000 at Bletchley Park, 80% of them women, worked around the clock operating 200 bombs and the electronic Colossus machines. By 1944, they were decoding 5,000 German messages daily, the nervous system of the Nazi war machine laid bare in real time. The implications extended far beyond the Atlantic. British codebreakers shaped the course of the Mediterranean campaign, North Africa, and even the defense of Britain itself. Every success that Dönitz once attributed to Allied technology was in part a victory of mathematics and organization, the quiet triumph of a new kind of warfare information supremacy. Historians today describe it as the birth of signals intelligence, a field that has since defined global power. The discipline that broke Enigma would evolve into the modern cryptologic agencies, Britain's GCHQ and America's NSA. And the lesson they drew from Germany's blindness remains a cornerstone of strategic policy: no system is unbreakable. In the context of World War II, that blindness cost lives at an unimaginable scale. From 1941 to 1943, U-boat losses rose from 35 to 237 per year. May 1943, Black May saw 41 submarines destroyed in a single month. It was the turning point of the Battle of the Atlantic, and Dönitz never knew why. His reaction to the ultra-secret in 1974 was not rage but silence. A silence of comprehension, the sound of a man realizing that his war had been fought in the dark. For cryptographers, the story of Enigma is not merely a historical curiosity. It is a warning about the intersection of confidence and catastrophe. Mathematically, Enigma was elegant. Operationally, it was vulnerable, compromised by procedural flaws, predictable message keys, and human behavior. In 1974, as computer networks began to define a new age, intelligence agencies worldwide studied the German failure as a case study in cognitive bias. RAND and the U.S. Department of Defense cited it as a textbook example of institutional blindness, where systems built on intellectual pride refused to acknowledge the possibility of failure. The moral was simple: encryption is never absolute. Neither is certainty. Dönitz closed the book that day, knowing that his submarines had not been defeated by sonar or depth charges, but by logic, by an enemy who listened more carefully than he imagined possible. The commander, who once believed he controlled the tides of war, now understood that the currents had always been guided by unseen hands. He never recovered from that revelation. By the summer of 1941, the illusion of German dominance at sea had already begun to unravel, but few within the Kriegsmarine recognized it. To the admirals in Berlin, the Atlantic War was a contest of steel and endurance. To the cryptanalysts in Bletchley Park, it was a pattern waiting to be solved. What Germany viewed as an engineering triumph, a cipher of infinite combinations, had in reality become its greatest liability. The mathematics of Enigma seemed invincible. 3 rotors, offering over 17,000 positions, multiplied by 60 possible rotor orders, multiplied again by billions of plugboard connections. In total, over 150 trillion potential configurations. On paper, that made the machine unbreakable. But the Allied counterargument wasn't found in equations. It was found in people. In 1932, Polish mathematician Marian Rejewski had already uncovered a fatal procedural flaw. German operators repeated the same message key twice at the start of each transmission, a redundancy that provided a narrow crack in Enigma's armor. With the outbreak of war, that knowledge passed to British hands, where mathematicians like Alan Turing and Gordon Welchman turned it into an industrial process. Where German cryptographers worked with slide rules, pencils, and faith, the British built machines, mechanical minds that never slept. The first bomb could test 17,000 rotor positions in 20 minutes. By 1943, entire halls of machines were working in synchronization, decoding messages faster than Enigma could encrypt them. To Germany, this level of organization was unimaginable. As Dr. Erich Hüttenhain, head of the Wehrmacht's cipher department, would later confess under interrogation, "We calculated that breaking Enigma would require more effort than any nation would rationally devote to cryptanalysis. We were wrong." Yet even as Allied intelligence was achieving industrial-scale success, German analysts were dismissing every clue. When supply ships hidden deep in the Atlantic were intercepted in 1941, statistical probability alone suggested a leak. The odds of random discovery across millions of square miles were infinitesimal, yet the conclusion drawn was not espionage, not cryptographic compromise, but improved British radar. The psychology of denial became institutional. Reports questioning Enigma's integrity were filed, discussed, and quietly buried. Admiral Dönitz himself wrote in his January 1942 war diary, "An insight into our cipher does not come into consideration." From that point forward, the course of the Atlantic War became a tragic equation, precision multiplied by blindness. While Dönitz believed he was orchestrating victory, Bletchley Park had already turned his command structure into a transparent network. His centralized control, the famed Befehlstaktik system, was both efficient and suicidal. By requiring U-boats to report their positions daily, Dönitz gave the Allies a living map of his fleet. Each message encrypted through Enigma was an arrow pointing toward destruction. Every U-boat's position, every fuel status report, every tactical order, all intercepted, all read. The irony grew crueler with each passing month. When German naval engineers introduced the new four-rotor Enigma, the M4 Triton machine in 1942, Dönitz believed it would restore secrecy. The added complexity was supposed to multiply possible settings by 26, a mathematical mountain no one could climb. His own analysts tested it for 100 days and failed, declaring it unbreakable. But in the quiet rooms of Bletchley Park, the challenge had already been met. When sailors from HMS Petard recovered Enigma codebooks from the sinking U-559 in October 1942, they paid with their lives, but their sacrifice reopened the flow of naval intelligence. Within months, British cryptanalysts had mastered the new cipher. The battle resumed, this time with even greater precision. In the first half of 1943, German losses rose exponentially. Convoys that should have been easy prey began maneuvering away moments before attack. Wolf packs assembled at secret rendezvous were ambushed by aircraft and destroyers. To Dönitz, it appeared as if the Allies had developed a sixth sense, supernatural intuition. The truth was worse. They had Ultra. Ultra, the code name for all intelligence derived from Enigma decrypts, was more than a program. It was an empire of secrecy. Controlled by the Special Liaison Units, SLUs, under Group Captain Frederick Winterbotham, Ultra's information was shared only with top Allied commanders, never transmitted openly, and always disguised through deception. If Ultra revealed a U-boat refueling point, the Royal Navy might accidentally spot it through aerial reconnaissance. If an Italian convoy was to be ambushed, a convenient spy report or radar contact was fabricated to explain the foreknowledge. The deception was so perfect that even Allied pilots believed their victories were the result of luck and skill, not mathematics and machines. Historians at the Rand Corporation later described Ultra as the most successful information, denial, and deception operation in modern history. The Allies didn't just read the enemy's communications, they hid the fact that they were doing it, ensuring the advantage lasted for years. The consequences reached every corner of the Axis war effort. In the Mediterranean, Ultra exposed Italian fleet movements, leading to the Battle of Cape Matapan, where over 2,400 Italian sailors died in an ambush their commanders never understood. In the skies over Europe, Luftwaffe raids were intercepted because the British already knew target coordinates. By 1943, the British and Americans had achieved what modern analysts would call strategic omniscience. They could see the war in real time, not through spies or guesswork, but through the enemy's own words. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Dönitz remained trapped inside his own certainty. When subordinates questioned whether the cipher might be compromised, his response was immediate and absolute. The mathematics made it impossible. German science, he insisted, did not fail. In hindsight, his belief was not arrogance, but the logical endpoint of a worldview built on control. Dönitz had risen through the Navy by mastering systems, logistical, mechanical, organizational. To admit that his perfect system was vulnerable was to admit that his entire philosophy of command was flawed. It is here that historians find the deeper lesson of Enigma. Technological superiority means nothing without intellectual humility. When the war ended, Allied intelligence teams under Operation Tycom interrogated German cryptographic experts. Their shock was universal. Dr. Huttenheim, when told the Allies had been reading Enigma since 1940, reportedly said, "Impossible. That would require thousands of people and resources beyond imagination." He was told the truth and sat in silence. What Germany never understood was that its own success in breaking some British codes had blinded it further. As one captured analyst later put it, "We knew how difficult it was. We assumed they were as limited as we were." That assumption cost them the war at sea. By the time the ultra-secret revealed the truth in 1974, Dönitz had lived with the ghosts of 30,000 lost submariners for decades. The revelation didn't change the outcome, but it changed the meaning. His war had not been a contest of machines and men, but of imagination. And in that unseen battlefield, Germany had never stood a chance. The scale of Germany's blindness became most apparent in what came to be known as Black May. May 1943, the month the Battle of the Atlantic was effectively lost. By then, Dönitz commanded over 100 U-boats operating in the North Atlantic. He believed victory was within reach. His war diary entry from May 1st read, "The enemy is showing signs of exhaustion. One more concentrated effort and the Atlantic lifeline will be cut." But his optimism was a delusion. In the same week, British cryptanalysts had achieved a decisive breakthrough in reading the new four-rotor Enigma messages, aided by the heroism of sailors from HMS Petard, who had recovered the necessary codebooks from the sinking U-5559 months earlier. Inside Bletchley Park, Colossus, the world's first programmable electronic computer had begun turning Enigma's complexity into an advantage. What once seemed an uncrackable cipher was now being processed in near real time. Allied commanders were reading German orders faster than the German fleet itself. The first convoy battle of that May set the pattern. Convoy OS-542 merchant ships bound from Liverpool to Halifax was detected by U-650. Dönitz, eager for a decisive blow, massed 41 submarines for attack, his largest wolf pack yet. But every deployment order he sent was decrypted at Bletchley within hours. The Allied Admiralty's Operational Intelligence Center rerouted convoys through safe gaps while sending hunter-killer groups directly onto the assembling submarines. 6 days of fighting turned into a massacre. 13 merchant ships were lost, but 7 U-boats were destroyed. Each subsequent engagement repeated the same grim arithmetic. In mid-May, convoy HX-237 crossed unscathed, while 5 submarines were sunk. Convoy SC-130 saw the same result. By month's end, 41 German U-boats lay on the ocean floor, nearly a quarter of Dönitz's active fleet. For the first time, the balance of attrition favored the Allies. Dönitz, baffled, concluded that new Allied radar or sonar must be responsible. In reality, the The decisive factor was information every tactical move dictated by ultra-intelligence. In modern military analysis, what occurred that spring is often described as the first algorithmic war, a conflict determined by computation rather than by chance or courage. RAND historian Paul Kennedy later observed, "Germany's defeat in the Atlantic was not the product of superior tonnage or aircraft alone, but of superior information flow and early demonstration of what we now call network-centric warfare." Yet to the Germans of 1943, the evidence of cryptographic compromise was almost impossible to accept. Every time a new technological explanation was disproved, a more elaborate one took its place. Investigators proposed infrared detection systems, magnetic anomaly sensors, even the possibility that Allied aircraft could detect the heat signatures of diesel engines through clouds. Each theory seemed more plausible than the unthinkable that Enigma itself was broken. One particularly tragic episode illustrates the depth of that denial. In August 1943, the Swiss intelligence service, officially neutral and generally reliable, sent a direct warning to Admiral Wilhelm Canaris of the Abwehr Germany's military intelligence service. Their report was explicit. Over the last few months, Germany's naval ciphers have been successfully broken. Orders to U-boats are being read currently. The message was forwarded to Dönitz. His diary for August 13th records his reaction. Report from Switzerland claims enemy is reading our cipher. This is unbelievable. He ordered an investigation, but it was structured to disprove the claim. The inquiry's conclusion was almost comical. In hindsight, the report was labeled Allied Disinformation, designed to sap German morale. The committee's reasoning was revealing. If the enemy can read our communications, why have they not achieved even greater success? Why are some convoys still attacked? Why are some submarines returning safely? The answer, of course, was that the Allies chose not to exploit every decrypt. They intentionally allowed some U-boats to survive, some convoys to fall, maintaining the illusion of uncertainty to protect Ultra's secrecy. This calculated restraint, accepting casualties to preserve a secret, stands among the most disciplined acts of wartime deception ever recorded. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill called Ultra the goose that laid the golden eggs, but never cackled. Its silence was strategic, its preservation priceless. Meanwhile, Dönitz doubled down on his command philosophy. The same radio discipline that made him a master tactician in 1940 was now a death sentence. His centralized control required constant communication, daily position reports, fuel states, attack orders. By 1943, those very transmissions were mapping his fleet for the enemy. Modern analysts often describe Dönitz's system as an early form of digital overexposure, too much information moving through a compromised network. In today's cybersecurity lexicon, the U-boat command structure was the equivalent of a perfectly designed system transmitting every secret over an unsecured line. It is perhaps the cruelest irony of Enigma's story. The very precision and order that once defined German engineering became its undoing. By late 1943, Bletchley Park's machinery had reached industrial scale. 10 Colossus computers processed 5,000 characters per second. Over 9,000 personnel worked 3 shifts, decoding thousands of intercepted messages each day. Each decoded message was indexed, cross-referenced, and correlated an enormous analog database years before the concept of big data existed. Within this ocean of information, British analysts identified behavioral fingerprints of individual German operators, the radio man who used his girlfriend's initials as part of the key, the commander who repeated standard phrases in weather reports. These human patterns became cryptanalytic gold statistical habits that machines could exploit. By comparison, the German B-Dienst Cryptologic Bureau was brilliant but artisanal. Its mathematicians were few, its resources limited, its methods traditional. When interrogated after the war, one B-Dienst officer summarized the imbalance. "You treated cryptanalysis like an industry. We treated it like an art." The result was industrial defeat. When the British and Americans reviewed wartime data in 1945, they calculated that ultra-intelligence had shortened the European war by at least 2 years. It saved an estimated 2 million tons of shipping and hundreds of thousands of lives. The statistics of the Atlantic campaign alone revealed the asymmetry. 783 U-boats lost out of 162 commissioned, a 67% destruction rate. Among the 40,000 submariners who served, 30,000 were killed. These were not random losses. They were algorithmic inevitabilities, consequences of mathematical visibility, masquerading as military misfortune. For Germany's surviving officers, the revelation decades later was unbearable. To realize that every brilliant maneuver, every desperate innovation, every technical improvement had been anticipated and countered not through divine luck or espionage, but through numbers, was to confront the deepest betrayal of all betrayal by certainty itself. When Dönitz read The Ultra Secret in 1974, that truth finally reached him. The war he thought he had fought had never existed. His submarines had sailed blind not against radar, but against reason. The war had long been over, but for Admiral Karl Dönitz, May 1945 remained frozen in time, the month he ordered his last U-boats to return from the sea, not in triumph, but in surrender. He ended his war believing he had been defeated by material superiority, Allied aircraft radar, and sheer industrial might. Yet, as the decades passed and the truth emerged, those assumptions collapsed like the wrecks of submarines littering the ocean floor. In post-war interrogations under Operation TICOM, Target Intelligence Committee Allied officers faced a gallery of brilliant yet bewildered German cryptographers who could not comprehend what had happened. Dr. Erich Hüttenhain, head of the OKWII, listened in disbelief when British officers explained that Enigma had been systematically read since 1940. "Impossible," he said. "The mathematics forbid it." When shown actual decrypted messages, his reply was stunned. Silence. Then a whisper. "You must have devoted an entire army to this." They had, though, not one of soldiers. It was an army of minds. By 1944, Bletchley Park had become a proto-digital factory, operating at an intensity that no German scientist imagined possible. Its workforce, mathematicians, typists, machine operators, translators, functioned in shifts around the clock. The operation resembled a wartime version of a Silicon Valley campus innovation powered by urgency collaboration under secrecy. Within its walls, Colossus, the world's first programmable electronic computer, was devouring encrypted traffic at 5,000 characters per second. What had begun as a small code-breaking experiment in 1939 evolved into the world's first data-driven intelligence system. By cross-referencing decrypted material, Bletchley's analysts constructed behavioral profiles of German radio operators, cataloged transmission habits, and even predicted who would violate cipher discipline next. The war's turning point had not been a single battle, but a shift in paradigm from steel to silicon, from courage to computation. German analysts working in isolation and under rigid hierarchy could not compete. At their peak, fewer than 1,000 men and women worked in German cipher offices. Their tools were slide rules and mechanical calculators. When asked after the war why they never imagined the Allies could break Enigma, one officer gave a telling reply: "We measured the world by what we could build, not by what others might imagine." That failure of imagination became Germany's fatal flaw. In 1941 and 1942, every warning sign had been visible. U-boats were ambushed in remote locations. Convoys slipped through patrol lines as if guided by prophecy. But when German investigators presented these patterns to Naval Command, they encountered an immovable wall institutional certainty. Reports questioning Enigma's integrity were redrafted, conclusions softened, and the issue quietly shelved. To question the cipher was to question German science itself. Even when U-570 was captured almost intact in 1941, providing the British with cryptographic materials, Admiral Dönitz dismissed it. His reasoning was airtight and wrong. Even if the British had obtained machines and codebooks, he argued their advantage would last only until the next key change. In theory, that was true. In practice, British ingenuity made the impossible continuous. By 1943, British and American naval intelligence could read Dönitz's orders within hours of transmission. When he instructed his wolf packs to converge, Allied convoys veered away before contact. When he rerouted his boats, the hunter-killer groups were already waiting. To modern intelligence historians, the German failure stands as one of the most striking examples of confirmation bias ever documented. Each new anomaly, each loss that defied probability, was explained through more elaborate technical theories. Infrared detection radar advances, even psychic espionage were proposed before anyone dared to consider the unthinkable that their most sacred system had failed. The tragedy deepened with the Lucy Ring, a Soviet spy network based in neutral Switzerland. From 1942 onward, it began sending Moscow stunningly accurate reports about German operations, including verbatim orders. German counterintelligence alarmed by the precision suspected traitors in their highest ranks. They launched investigations into dozens of officers, including members of Hitler's own operations staff. The truth, which no one uncovered, was far simpler. The reports were sourced from Ultra. To protect their secret, British intelligence had devised an ingenious pipeline. They fed select decrypted information to Swiss intermediaries under the cover of an anti-Nazi informant network, who then passed it to the Soviets. The result was perfect misdirection. Germany searched for a spy that never existed. In retrospect, this deception achieved something remarkable. It redirected German suspicion inward while keeping Ultra intact. The Abwehr interrogated its own officers. Gestapo files ballooned with false accusations, and yet the real leak, a British computing machine, remained unimagined. When the war finally collapsed in 1945, the post-war German narrative was one of misplaced explanations. We lost because of radar, Rader wrote. We lost because of aircraft, echoed Luftwaffe generals. We lost because of oil. All true, but all secondary. The real cause, the silent reading of their war's every heartbeat, remained classified for 3 more decades. When Group Captain Frederick Winterbotham finally broke the silence with the ultra-secret in 1974, it detonated like a delayed bomb across Europe. Historians scrambled to rewrite entire campaigns. Naval veterans read the book with disbelief and grief. General Adolf Galland, who had commanded the Luftwaffe's fighter forces, reportedly said, "For 30 years, I wondered how the enemy always knew. Now I know they were reading our orders before we were." For Dönitz, the revelation was existential. In a letter to the publisher, he claimed he had always suspected compromise. But his wartime diaries betrayed the truth. Never once had he considered it possible. His belief in Enigma's invulnerability had been absolute, almost theological. The machine had not merely been a cipher, it had been a symbol of German intellect, order, and faith in technology. And that faith, he now realized, had killed his fleet. To intelligence professionals today, the Enigma failure is taught as a lesson in organizational psychology as much as cryptography. The National Security Agency in the US and GCHQ in Britain use it to train analysts to challenge assumptions and question systems that appear too perfect. Rand's 1985 Strategic Studies report cited Enigma as a case where the enemy's overconfidence was more decisive than any weapon. In Dönitz's twilight years, that truth became unbearable. He withdrew from public life, living quietly near Hamburg. Visitors described him as polite, but distant, spending hours recalculating old naval operations with new knowledge, each equation ending in the same result: defeat by ignorance. One interview from 1979, a year before his death, captured the essence of his regret. "Suspicion and knowledge are not the same," he said. "To suspect the enemy has advantages is prudence. To know he reads your every thought, that is madness." He paused, staring toward the horizon that had claimed so many of his men. "The greatest tragedy is not that we lost, but that we never knew why." That sentence has since become a maxim in intelligence circles, engraved above exhibits at Bletchley Park and cited in declassified NSA lectures. Because beyond the mathematics, beyond the machines, the story of Enigma is not about cryptography. It is about certainty and the ruin it brings when unexamined. By the spring of 1945, the war had ended, but for Admiral Karl Dönitz, it never truly stopped. He had commanded a fleet that no longer existed. 783 submarines gone to the bottom, with more than 30,000 men. In the ruined post-war Germany, he would replay every decision, convinced that Allied radar aircraft and industry had simply overwhelmed him. When the ultra-secret appeared 3 decades later, the revelation that his orders had been read in real time reopened every wound. The Allied investigators who confronted Germany's cryptographers after the surrender found astonishment bordering on disbelief. Dr. Erich Hüttenhain, head of the Wehrmacht Cipher Bureau, told his interrogators that the mathematics of Enigma made compromise impossible. When they laid decoded messages on the table, he whispered, "Then you must have employed an entire army." In a sense, they had. At Bletchley Park, more than 9,000 civilians, 4/5 of them women, worked in shifts around the clock. 10 Colossus computers, the first programmable electronic machines on Earth, tested thousands of rotor settings each second. Intelligence that had once taken weeks to extract was now delivered in hours. What the Germans had treated as a craft, the British had turned into an industry. Each intercept was cataloged, cross-referenced, and fed into an ever-growing database of operator habits: the careless officer who reused his girlfriend's initials, the radio man who began every weather report the same way. To Dönitz, the war had been fought in fog. To Bletchley, it had been fought in numbers. Inside the Reich, those numbers were unreadable signs. Reports of convoys that zigzagged away moments before contact were dismissed as improved enemy radar. U-boats destroyed at refueling points known only to headquarters were blamed on spies. When Swiss intelligence warned in August 1943 that the Allies were reading German naval traffic, the message was filed under Allied disinformation. The investigating committee concluded that if the enemy could read their signals, he would have won already. The logic was circular, but comforting and fatal. The Allies helped maintain that illusion. To preserve Ultra's secrecy, they staged plausible coincidences, reconnaissance flights, timed to justify attacks already ordered, from decrypted signals, radio messages praising imaginary agents for information actually gained from Enigma. Even Allied crews often believed the cover stories. Historians at RAND would later call Ultra the perfect deception ecosystem, a model of how intelligence could be used without revealing its source. Nowhere did that deception cut deeper than in the story of the Lucy Ring, a Soviet spy network operating out of neutral Switzerland. Beginning in 1942, Lucy sent Moscow detailed German operational plans, sometimes verbatim orders signed by Hitler himself. The Gestapo launched endless hunts for traitors inside the general staff, but the leak came not from Berlin, but from Britain. Ultra decrypts were quietly laundered through Swiss intermediaries to the Soviets, giving Stalin reliable intelligence while diverting German suspicion toward phantom conspirators. The Abwehr interrogated its own officers. None ever realized that the true source was an English computer in a Buckinghamshire mansion. When Germany collapsed, the myth of technological defeat hardened into history. Admirals wrote that radar had betrayed their fleet's generals, that fuel shortages and air power had crushed their armies. The deeper reality that their enemies had read their every move remained sealed under the Official Secrets Act. Only in 1974, when Group Captain Frederick Winterbotham published the ultra-secret, did the truth emerge. The reaction among German veterans was disbelief, then grief. For 30 years, said Luftwaffe ace Adolf Galland, I wondered how they always knew. Now I know they were reading our orders before we were. Dönitz's response mixed pride and despair. Publicly, he insisted that he had suspected a compromise all along. Privately, his diaries proved otherwise. The admiral who had once embodied the precision of German command now saw that his perfectionism had fed the catastrophe. His centralized radio network, his proudest innovation, had made every submarine visible to the enemy. The flaw was not in mathematics, but in mentality. To modern analysts, the Enigma story is less about code breaking than about cognitive failure. The NSA and GCHQ still teach it as a warning: never assume that a system is secure because its design is elegant. Rand's 1985 Strategic Studies report called it a case where overconfidence was a deadlier weapon than any bomb. Dönitz himself came to echo that verdict in his last interview in 1979. Suspicion and knowledge are not the same, he said. To suspect the enemy has advantages is prudence. To know he reads your every thought, that is madness. We were certain Enigma was secure. That certainty killed more of my men than all the depth charges in the Allied arsenal. By the late 1970s, 30 years after the war's end, the silence surrounding Ultra finally fractured. What had been the most closely guarded secret of World War II began to surface in declassified fragments, memoirs, and conferences that reunited men and women who had once fought an invisible war of logic. For the Germans who attended it was less a history lesson than an autopsy of faith. At a 1978 symposium hosted by the German Marine Institute, former officers of the Kriegsmarine faced the British cryptanalysts who had undone them. On stage sat Harry Hinsley, now the official historian of British intelligence opposite Wilhelm Trano, and several surviving members of the B-Dienst, the German Naval Intelligence Service. Hinsley calmly explained how Britain had industrialized cryptanalysis, thousands of workers' banks, of Bombe's the first electronic computers. The numbers were staggering: 5,000 intercepted messages a day, most of them decrypted within hours. When he projected copies of actual German messages still stamped Geheime Kommandosache, the room fell silent. Trano listened with professional admiration, tinged with disbelief. He asked precise questions about rotor wiring permutations and probability heuristics, clearly impressed by the mathematical elegance. But as the implications sank in, that his own triumphs reading British convoy codes had merely helped the British to trap his submarines, his composure broke. Others were less restrained. When staff officers from Dönitz's wartime headquarters attempted to defend their decisions as strategic necessity, U-boat ace Otto Kretschmer erupted. Strategic necessity. We were sending men to their deaths in operations the enemy already knew about. Every patrol order, every tactic, they read it all, and you still call it strategy. The exchange nearly became physical before moderators intervened, yet the outburst captured what many veterans felt: betrayal, not by enemies, but by the unshakable confidence of their own system. In the years that followed, German cryptographers undertook their own post-mortem of Enigma. The verdict was paradoxical. The mathematics were sound. The failure was human. The initial Polish breakthrough of 1932 had exploited a trivial procedural flaw the repeated transmission of message keys at the start of each signal. That redundancy, intended to ensure accuracy, had exposed the internal logic of Enigma's rotors. By the time Germany corrected the error in 1940, the Allies had already built a working model. Turing and Welchman's Bombe exploited another small oversight no letter could encode to itself. Against human discipline, that rule seemed harmless. To a machine testing thousands of hypotheses per second, it was a door left ajar. Other weaknesses were cultural. German operators were meticulous, but predictable. Weather messages, situation reports, and even daily greetings followed rigid templates, perfect cribs for Bletchley Park's algorithms. The Navy's insistence on strict formatting meant to enforce order provided the patterns that broke it. Worse still, when the B-Dienst successfully penetrated British codes, the victory convinced them that codebreaking was an art requiring genius, not mass production. They never imagined that the Allies had turned it into an assembly line. As one post-war analyst wrote, "They believed in poets. We believed in factories." By the 1980s, historians estimated that Ultra had shortened the war by at least 2 years, perhaps 4. Its operational impact was measurable. Between 300 and 500 merchant ships saved roughly 2 million tons of cargo that would have starved Britain without rerouting intelligence. The Battle of the Atlantic, once seen as a duel of radar and sonar, was reinterpreted as a data war. In North Africa, Ultra allowed Montgomery to fight Rommel with exact knowledge of his fuel reserves, his tank counts, even the position of his command car. In Normandy, it revealed what German commanders believed information so complete that Allied planners could sculpt deception around it in real time. The psychological shock of these revelations on German veterans was profound. Many had lived decades comforted by the idea of defeat through overwhelming odds. Now they faced a different reality. They had never truly stood a chance. Historian Friedrich Ruge described the mood among former officers as a second defeat. Support groups of U-boat survivors began inviting historians to explain Ultra so that, in their words, we can at least understand why our friends died. Some found bitter solace in learning that their failure was not personal, but systemic. Others felt the wound reopen proof that their valor had been spent in a rigged game. Yet out of this reckoning came reform. The newly formed Bundeswehr and BND built communication protocols designed explicitly to avoid another enigma. Messages were fragmented across multiple channels. Encryption systems changed hourly rather than daily. No commander could rely on a single secure device. The trauma of Enigma produced an institutional humility, an assumption that every code could be broken, every secret overheard. That skepticism, analysts note, became a quiet strength of post-war German intelligence. In the wider world, Ultra reshaped modern doctrine. NATO planners studying the Enigma case concluded that information dominance, what the Rand Corporation would later term situational awareness, was more decisive than firepower. The lesson filtered into the computer age from satellite networks to cyber defense. The warning was the same. No encryption is unbreakable, and the greatest vulnerability is belief otherwise. For Dönitz, who lived until 1980, that lesson arrived too late. Visitors to his modest home near Hamburg described an aging man surrounded by charts, still recalculating lost battles, still searching for alternative outcomes. One former aide recalled him tracing convoy routes on a faded map and whispering, "If only I had known." But there were no alternate equations, no different endings. The mathematics had been flawless. The assumptions had not. By the 1990s, historians had reconstructed the full dimension of the Enigma catastrophe. What emerged was less a story of mathematical defeat than one of psychological blindness, how intelligence, when filtered through certainty, can collapse in on itself. German military historians, such as Jürgen Rover and Friedrich Ruge, published exhaustive studies revealing that between 1941 and 1943, Allied knowledge of German naval movements exceeded even what Dönitz's own staff knew. The British Operational Intelligence Center could track each U-boat in real time, predicting routes and timing of attacks with a precision that would not be matched again until the age of satellites. To many post-war analysts, this was the first true demonstration of what modern defense theorists now call information superiority. For German officers revisiting their wartime reports, the documents read like confessions written in code. Notes that once attributed losses to improved radar air saturation or technical failure now appeared almost delusional. In every engagement from the Bismarck's hunt to the collapse of the wolf packs, the fingerprints of Ultra were visible. Each coincidence that commanders had dismissed as bad luck became in hindsight an act of calculated precision by adversaries reading their mail. The post-Ultra generation of scholars began mapping these revelations onto the broader psychology of war. The Rand Corporation's 1994 study, Cognitive Failures in High-Security Organizations, cited Enigma as the defining case of institutional myopia, where systems designed for perfection eliminate the capacity for self-critique. Rand's analysis concluded that Enigma's downfall was not due to encryption failure, but to epistemic arrogance, the refusal to imagine one's own vulnerability. At the U-Boat Veterans Association meetings in Hamburg, now attended by aging men in their 70s, the conversations had changed. In the 1950s, they had spoken about courage, weather, and fate. By the 1990s, the tone was somber, philosophical. A former commander of U-441 recalled, "We thought we fought the ocean. We were fighting mathematics. The enemy knew where we breathed." Psychologists studying these veterans noticed an unusual form of survivor's guilt, not for actions taken, but for a blindness shared. Knowing that their missions had been compromised from the start created a new kind of trauma, the awareness of predetermined defeat. Academics at the University of Hamburg later conducted interviews showing that for many, learning the truth provided an odd sense of closure. Their bravery had not been wasted through incompetence. It had been nullified by deception. "We were victims of certainty," one said. And certainty is the cruelest commander. Meanwhile, Western intelligence agencies quietly institutionalized the Enigma lesson. The U.S. National Security Agency NSA and Britain's GCHQ included it in training manuals as Case Study 1, The Cost of Certainty. Analysts were taught to challenge even proven systems, to treat every algorithm as potentially compromised, and to separate confidence from proof. Never fall in love with your own encryption became an unofficial maxim. Outside the intelligence community, the Enigma revelation also began influencing computer science and cybersecurity policy. In 1998, an MIT symposium on cryptographic ethics used Enigma as the opening example in a discussion of public key infrastructure, the dangers of assuming any code, however sophisticated, is permanent. Scholars noted that Turing's machines had not merely cracked ciphers, they had launched the conceptual age of computing, proving that information itself could be weaponized. Yet, for all the technical fascination, the human story remained the most haunting. Tens of thousands of U-boat sailors had died, believing they were victims of superior machines. In truth, they were victims of superior organization, of a bureaucracy that questioned nothing. Even the courage of commanders like Otto Kretschmer, who achieved legendary status before being captured in 1941, now seemed tragic. Every tactical victory they achieved only fed the illusion that their systems worked. The depth of the German psychological investment in Enigma can be measured by how it persisted even after the war. For nearly 3 decades, the veterans community and German military historians repeated the same explanations radar sonar luck, without anyone daring to ask the forbidden question. What if Enigma was broken? The fact that such an obvious hypothesis was absent from hundreds of post-war analyses showed how total the blindness had been. At the 1995 anniversary event at Bletchley Park, among visitors signing the guest book was a man in his 60s from Bremen. His handwriting was small and deliberate. My grandfather commanded U-604, lost with all hands in August 1943. For 50 years, I believed he died fighting overwhelming Allied technology. Now I know he died because his orders were read before he received them. The tragedy is not that Germany lost, but that we never knew we had already lost. That entry displayed under glass today captures the quiet essence of the Enigma story, not the triumph of one side over another, but the human cost of unexamined certainty. In the broader history of intelligence, Enigma became a mirror held up to every nation that believed itself invulnerable. The Allies' success proved that the future of warfare would belong not to those with the biggest guns, but to those who could see furthest into the enemy's mind. In 2001, the International Institute for Strategic Studies described Bletchley Park as the birthplace of predictive warfare, the moment when information, not firepower, became decisive. For the Germans, that knowledge arrived too late, not as a revelation of defeat, but as a reminder of how belief itself can be weaponized. By the early 2000s, as the last living veterans of Bletchley Park and the Kriegsmarine began to fade from memory, the Enigma story underwent a transformation. What had once been military history was now a case study taught in universities, cybersecurity firms, and defense academies alike. A timeless parable about how intellect can destroy itself through arrogance. The old admiral's reflection. The greatest tragedy is not that we lost, but that we never knew why had become something larger than a personal lament. It was quoted in intelligence briefings, cyber warfare manuals, and leadership seminars from Washington to Berlin. For the first time, Enigma was being studied not as a code, but as a cognitive phenomenon, how organizations become blind to their own assumptions. At the U.S. Naval War College, an entire module titled The Enigma Lesson was added to officer training in 2003. The lecture's opening slide was blunt. The Germans didn't lose the encryption war because Enigma was weak. They lost because they believed it was perfect. Students were asked to imagine themselves as Dönitz, a commander convinced of his own system's invulnerability, while evidence of failure mounted daily. The goal wasn't to shame the past, but to inoculate the future, to remind military and intelligence leaders that the moment one stops questioning one's own tools is the moment those tools begin to fail. Meanwhile, historians uncovered how deeply Enigma's legacy had shaped post-war intelligence architecture. British codebreakers who had worked under Alan Turing went on to design the earliest NSA crypto systems and later the secure communication protocols used by NATO. Their philosophy was radically different from Dönitz's Germany. No encryption method was ever to be trusted without constant attack and red team testing. The lesson of 1943 became a principle of 21st century security: assume compromise, plan for resilience. The story's emotional weight, however, remained human. Every newly declassified document revealed another missed warning, another mind trapped in certainty. In 2005, the British National Archives released correspondence showing that as early as 1941, several German naval officers had expressed doubts about Enigma's security, only to be reprimanded for defeatist thinking. One memo from Captain Hans Schmid read, "It is mathematically possible, however improbable, that our cipher could be reconstructed by those with captured material and sufficient persistence." His report was buried, marked "no further action required." 70 years later, cybersecurity analysts would call Schmid's memo the first German penetration test. At Bletchley Park now, a museum visitors stood in silence before the hulking gray Enigma machines encased behind glass. Each rotor click represented a human life once measured in probabilities. School children pressed the keys and watched lights flash, reenacting the same motions that had once decided the fate of convoys, cities, and nations. A small plaque nearby reads, "Mathematics won a war, but certainty lost one." For surviving British veterans, the reopening of those huts was bittersweet. Many had carried their secret into old age, forbidden for decades to tell even their spouses what they had done. "We held the world's greatest secret," said codebreaker Mavis Beatty, "and we couldn't tell anyone." Some had died before recognition came. Others received medals from a country that barely remembered their names. Yet all agreed that the secrecy had been necessary. Without it, the war and perhaps history itself might have turned out differently. The German reaction was more complex. Younger generations visiting Bletchley in the 2000s often described a quiet fascination, even reverence. For them, Enigma was no longer a symbol of shame, but a cautionary monument proof that intelligence, no matter how advanced, collapses when insulated from doubt. "My grandfather built machines," one visitor wrote in the guest log. They failed not because they were wrong, but because he believed they couldn't be. Academics coined new terms from the wreckage of that belief: encryption, hubris, algorithmic certainty, systemic blindness. Rand researchers drew direct parallels between Enigma and modern cybersecurity crises, from the overconfidence in untested encryption algorithms to the misplaced trust in secure digital infrastructure. A 2012 World Bank cybersecurity paper even cited Enigma in its preface, warning that no system, no matter how mathematically elegant, can survive the negligence of unquestioned faith. The echo of 1943 could be heard in every modern breach: corporations undone by insider leaks, governments surprised by adversaries exploiting software they believed secure. The technological scale had changed, but the psychology had not. Like Dönitz, leaders of the digital age often mistake complexity for invulnerability. Bletchley's legacy also lived on in computer science. Alan Turing's theoretical work on the Bombe and Colossus laid the foundations for programmable logic, the same architecture that would later power the Internet. In a twist of fate, the machine built to defeat secrecy became the architecture of a world where secrecy itself is almost impossible. In that sense, Enigma's ghost still lingers. Each new encryption protocol, each security breach, each cyber warfare doctrine owes something to those wartime rotors turning endlessly in 1940s England. Historians now describe Enigma not merely as a cipher machine, but as the birth cry of the information age, the moment humanity discovered that data could decide destiny. And yet, amid the modern fascination with algorithms and artificial intelligence, the human lesson remains the same. No machine can compensate for the failure to question one's own assumptions. The last living witness to both sides of that invisible war, a British operator named Jean Valentine, said it best in a 2009 interview. "We didn't defeat Enigma because we were cleverer. We defeated it because we doubted everything, even our own success." By the 2010s, the Enigma story had crossed from history into culture. It was no longer confined to academic conferences or cryptologic journals. It was part of the global language of technology. Engineers, economists, and philosophers invoked it to describe the dangers of systems that grow so complex that no one dares to question them. At the Cambridge Center for the Study of Existential Risk, researchers studying artificial intelligence quoted Dönitz's old warning: "Suspicion and knowledge are not the same as an ethical guideline." They used Enigma as a parable for the coming age of autonomous decision-making, what happens when human operators surrender critical control to mechanisms they no longer understand. Just as German command had trusted the Enigma machine to be infallible, Modern institutions were now trusting algorithms to make life-and-death judgments in finance, defense, and medicine. Meanwhile, governments and militaries began drawing direct lines between Enigma and contemporary cybersecurity. In 2014, GCHQ released a commemorative report marking 75 years since the beginning of Bletchley Park's operations. The conclusion was both celebratory and cautionary. The greatest victory of Enigma was not the breaking of a cipher, but the enduring reminder that human judgment must never be replaced by mechanical faith. Across the Atlantic, the NSA's Center for Cryptologic History hosted a joint exhibition with Germany's Bundesnachrichtendienst. For the first time, both former adversaries presented the Enigma episode not as a tale of victory or defeat, but of mutual enlightenment. The centerpiece was a single surviving M4 naval Enigma, its rotors frozen mid-turn. Beneath it, an inscription read in both English and German: "Trust is not security. Secrecy is not safety." At the opening ceremony, a gray-haired German naval historian spoke softly to the audience. In 1943, we built machines to protect our words. In 2013, we built machines to read each other's minds. The danger is the same, believing the machine understands truth. The hall fell silent. Even the young cryptographers' engineers raised on quantum encryption and zero-knowledge proofs nodded in recognition. As the digital century unfolded, parallels multiplied. The massive WannaCry ransomware attack of 2017, the SolarWinds breach of 2020, and even misconfigured cloud servers exposing millions of records all carried the same DNA as the U-boat disaster of 1943: overconfidence in technology, underestimation of human fallibility. The systems had changed, the mindset had not. Scholars began referring to these failures as digital enigmas. A 2021 RAND report titled "The Persistence of Overconfidence in Cyber Systems" opened with an uncanny echo of Bletchley Park's lesson. Security collapses not when encryption fails, but when imagination does. Even in popular culture, the theme resonated. Films like The Imitation Game brought Alan Turing's brilliance to mainstream audiences, while German documentaries such as Der letzte Befehl, The Last Order, re-examined Dönitz's tragic ignorance with empathy rather than condemnation. Viewers were struck not by the technological spectacle, but by the quiet moral contrast, one side defined by relentless curiosity, the other by unwavering certainty. In schools across Europe, Enigma became a staple of ethics curricula. Teachers used it to discuss responsibility in science, how progress without humility leads to catastrophe. At Gymnasium, Bremen, a classroom once located near a former U-boat base, students wrote essays on Dönitz's fateful diary entry. An insight into our cipher does not come into consideration. One student summarized what historians had spent decades unpacking. He didn't lose to the enemy. He lost to the idea that he couldn't be wrong. By 2025, the same sentence would appear in cybersecurity white papers, inscribed in PowerPoint slides, at tech summits, even quoted by CEOs in keynote speeches. The tragedy of Enigma had become a universal shorthand for the dangers of unchecked certainty in complex systems. At the reconstructed Hut 8 at Bletchley Park, the machine rooms now serve as digital literacy classrooms. Teenagers learn not only how the code was broken, but why it mattered. In one display, the narrative ends with a looping phrase projected onto the wall, fading in and out of the mist. We believed machines made us stronger. They only made our blindness more precise. Visitors stand in the dim light, the faint clatter of recorded rotors echoing through the room. Somewhere beyond the glass, the ghosts of Dönitz's fleet still move beneath the Atlantic's silent testaments to a war fought between logic and belief. The guide's closing words are simple, spoken every hour to each new group that enters. Every code ever written eventually breaks. The question is whether we recognize it before or after the damage is done. By the middle of the 2020s, the Enigma narrative had completed its long arc from a wartime secret to a moral mirror reflecting every age that followed. What began in a quiet English manor of wooden huts and humming machines had become a universal metaphor for civilization's struggle with certainty. At conferences about artificial intelligence and digital governance, scholars invoked Dönitz and Turing in the same breath, the admiral who believed that complexity guaranteed safety, and the mathematician who proved that questioning guarantees survival. Their duel, fought across oceans and equations, had evolved into the foundational parable of the information age. At the World Economic Forum of 2025, a keynote on cybersecurity ethics opened with the sound of mechanical rotors clicking through a speaker system. The presenter, a German-born data scientist, addressed an audience of executives and defense ministers. Enigma was not defeated by mathematics alone. It was defeated by humility. Every time we say our systems are unhackable, we are whispering Dönitz's last words to ourselves. The room fell quiet, the echo of the clicks fading into applause. In Germany, meanwhile, remembrance had matured into reflection. The once taboo discussions of wartime codebreaking were now central to courses in engineering ethics and digital sociology. Universities in Munich, Berlin, and Hamburg taught the Enigma paradigm, a curriculum blending history, psychology, and information theory. Students were asked not to memorize rotor sequences, but to analyze the mindset that produced them. At one seminar in Hamburg, a professor opened with a photograph of Dönitz at his desk, the old man reading The Ultra Secret. In 1974, his eyes hollow with recognition. The professor asked his students, "What does this photo show you?" A young woman replied softly, "That knowledge arrived too late." That answer, simple but devastating, captured the essence of the story that had spanned a century. In the world of intelligence, the echoes of Enigma continued to guide policy. NATO's 2026 cyber defense doctrine directly cited the case in its first paragraph. Complacency is the enemy's oldest ally. Every network, every cipher, every assumption must be treated as compromised until proven otherwise. The modern equivalents of Bletchley Park, vast data centers in Cheltenham, Fort Meade, and Bonn, now ran AI-driven cryptanalysis at speeds Turing could scarcely have imagined. Yet within those halls, reminders of humility remained. In one control room of GCHQ, a plaque mounted on the wall bears a simple inscription. Remember the U-boats? The Enigma story had also become a bridge between former enemies. Each year, British and German naval cadets met in a joint memorial ceremony at the Lebeau Naval Monument near Kiel. They laid wreaths for both the U-boat crews and the Bletchley operators, who together embodied the two sides of technological faith. During one such ceremony, a British officer spoke words that have since been engraved at the site. "They trusted the machine. We trusted doubt. May neither side forget what it cost." As the crowd stood in silence, the North Sea wind carried the faint sound of waves, the same waves that had once buried fleets and secrets alike. Back in England, Bletchley Park had become a sanctuary for digital pilgrims. Tourists walked through reconstructed huts filled with the smell of old paper and oil, while children tapped the Enigma keyboard, unaware that each glowing bulb once meant life or death. The museum guides ended every tour with the same line: "Intelligence is not what you know, it's how willing you are to question what you know." Outside in the courtyard, where the Codebreakers once hurried between huts under blackout curtains, a bronze statue of Alan Turing now stands opposite a small stone engraved with Dönitz's haunting words: "The greatest tragedy is not that we lost, but that we never knew why." Between them stretches a narrow walkway lined with metal plaques, each engraved with lessons drawn from the century of code and consequence. Every secret breeds its own weakness. Complexity is not security. Doubt is the highest form of defense. Visitors pass silently between these monuments, the rain tapping like Morse code against the bronze. For a moment, history feels circular, the same logic, the same hubris reinvented with every generation that forgets. In the end, the Enigma story outlived both its inventors and its breakers. It survived because it was never really about rotors or ciphers, but about the fragile human instinct to believe we have mastered uncertainty. And perhaps that is why even now, long after the last codebook has faded and the last veteran has gone, the question still lingers like static across the years. When our own systems fail, as they always do, will we recognize it before the sea closes over us again?